Welcome back for lunch. Hope you're all ready for our next session. My name is Pete Murphy, and I'm very pleased to be here. I am part of the Cybersecurity Advisory Council. I also, by day, work at Centelli Solutions. We're a data analytics, data science, and big data firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. And when I'm not doing all that stuff, I'm the president of the Charlotte SIM chapter. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to be associated with Montreat College. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce you to our panel moderator, David Thompson. David is the president and CEO of EdgePoint Limited. David founded EdgePoint about 15 or so years ago. He has 15 or so years of experience working in Washington, D.C. circles, and that'll be important in just a second. EdgePoint provides a full suite of consulting services in the areas of cybersecurity, defense, intelligence, homeland security, healthcare, education, international joint ventures, real estate ventures, and others. I've known David for a number of years, and I think you're going to be interested in the things that he has to say in the panel. David also served in the George W. Bush White House and worked for a top lobbying and consulting firm in Washington, where he developed strong networks on Capitol Hill and across the federal agencies. And President Maher has referred to David as his DC Sherpa. And some of you may know about the strong ties that Montreat has to Washington, D.C. A lot of support for Montreat coming from Washington, and it's largely due to the work that President Maher has done working with David. So thank you for that, David. Before all of that great stuff, David worked at Fox News for Hannity and Combs and the O'Reilly Factor in New York City. So please join me in welcoming our panel moderator, David Thompson.
Thank you, Pete. Pete ransomwared me earlier today. He was going to give his own version of my bio unless I paid him $50, and I did what every one of you in this room would have done. I paid, so I got through it. Thank you very much for being here, and this is an event, although not everybody's in this room, but this is the fourth retreat. Year one, we had under 100 people. It was somewhere around 70. This year, it's right at 500. So thank you for making this a great event and allowing it to continue to grow. Montreat continue to do great things. And as Pete said, a lot of that has been driven by the incredible support we've received from our congressional delegation, Senators Burr and Tillis, Congressman McHenry, and the state legislature, Jason Sain, who you'll hear from later, has been a critical champion of the college. And so we're very, very blessed that we have them in our universe. This was originally, and I'll toss it to the panel to introduce themselves briefly, but this was originally going to be a different topic. And then in September, the Department of Defense released the revised cyber strategy. And so I said, oh, I can actually talk about cyber war right after lunch when everybody's wanting to go to sleep. So that's fun. So we changed the topic, and we have an incredible panel. I know each of these people from DC and from other ventures, and so I'll just let you guys quickly introduce, and then I'll provide a brief overview and then kick it over to questions. And I'd love to have time at the end for Q&A from the audience if folks would like to participate. So, Brian?
Okay. My name is Brian Galker. I work with I'm employee of the National Security Agency. I work in the College of Cyber as one of the division chiefs, and part of my responsibilities include running the Centers of Academic Excellence programs, of which Dr. Maher pointed out this morning that Montreat is one of those select few. So of all the 3,000 colleges in the United States, only 266 of them are Centers of Academic Excellence. So Montreat carries that with pride, and I was happy to see that logo during one of his first slides this morning. We run a cyber defense program. We also run a cyber operations program that I'll be happy to talk about later. I'm also responsible for something called Gen Cyber. Gen Cyber is a national initiative where we are providing grants to different universities all across the country for them to run K through 12 summer camps. So I think I was going to start off by saying, are there any students here? And I'll talk about scholarships that are available. If there are any parents here, I'll talk about scholarships that are available. But also for younger children, this past summer, there were 3 Gen Cyber camps in North Carolina, 2 of them at Forsyth Tech and 1 at North Carolina A&T. So taking more than just a narrow NSA or government perspective, I'm responsible for some of these national programs. We're taking on those on behalf of the country, so it's not just a narrow government focus, but also for the greater good of the country. Obviously, we need great cyber defense across the nation in all the not only government, but private industry and academic phases as well. So defer to that and be happy to answer your questions and other David leads later.
Chris?
My name is Chris Cleary. I'd first like to say with my oldest daughter in college and 3 behind her, I'm very interested in talking to you about scholarships. So we will do that after the stage, so thank you for that information. I'm currently a vice president at Lighthouse, defense contractor in the Fort Meade area, focusing particularly on the intelligence and the cyber community, so back to the fence line over there. But my background before that is I've worked with various sort of commercial and other defense contracting companies. Last year I was here as a Tenable employee speaking to you about cybersecurity. My military background is 24 years as a naval intelligence officer with primarily a focus on cyber, doing offensive and defensive things at the fort. So we all kind of share an interesting history, having kind of even being unaware of it. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the talk about the national cyber strategy. Brian?
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Cyprian. I'm a supervisory special agent with the FBI. Between me and my colleague, we cover the entire state of North Carolina, focused in on criminal and national security investigations. So a lot of what we do is engaging with the public, the private sector, because ultimately they have the networks that we're trying to protect. Without that cooperation, sometimes those investigations are impeded. So our team is comprised of special agents, intelligence analysts, forensic examiners, and computer scientists. So from a recruitment standpoint, there are a lot of opportunities in the FBI. It's the greatest job in the world, and I look forward to talking more with you today.
Thank you very much. So as a baseline, has anybody read the revised national cyber strategy that was released? One, two, okay, all right.
Yeah.
So this was the first real overhaul of our national posture in cybersecurity since 2015. The Obama administration released theirs in 2015, and I'm sure it does not come as a shock to many people in the room that the one under the Trump administration has a slightly more aggressive tone to it. And what's really interesting for me in looking at this, especially in the evolution of policy, which is the world that I live in, some of the concepts that are discussed in the strategy. In fact, Chris Cleary and I were in a Senate intelligence skiff about 8 years ago discussing some of the more aggressive, offensive cyber postures that we thought the U.S. policy should start driving towards. And we were not met with the warmest response. The staffer actually came up to me at the end and said, "Yeah, you're in a skiff. You're actually looking for the padded room down the hall." But fast forward about 8 years, and some of that more aggressive tone has made its way into the national strategy. So it's very interesting for me to see that. Just in the introduction, just to read a quick blurb, it's talking about how Americans have accepted the internet as an open forum for information. And it says, our competitors and adversaries, however, have taken an opposite approach. They benefit from the open internet while constricting and controlling their own people's access to it and actively undermine the principles of an open internet and international forums. They hide behind notions of sovereignty while recklessly violating the laws of other states by engaging in pernicious economic espionage, malicious cyber activities, causing significant economic disruption and harm to individuals, commercial and non-commercial interests, and governments across the world. They view cyberspace as an arena where the United States' overwhelming military, economic, and political power could be neutralized and where the United States and its allies and partners are vulnerable. And I think that is one part that articulates something that I think we all know, but we don't talk about very often, which is in cybersecurity, you have this unique asymmetrical ability for, certainly for peer and near-peer state actors to maintain leverage and maintain par with us, but also for nowhere near peer status nations and actors, criminal networks, to also do significant levels of damage, and that is a significant national security concern. And for a long time, I have argued that we have not been as aggressive, perhaps, and that's not the word I want to use, but in showing the world that we're not going to tolerate the continued way of doing business. So this, for those that haven't read it, there are 4 pillars to the strategy, and that'll be up for the rest of the presentation, so you can kind of look at it. But Chris, let me ask you. So as a former operational planner at Cyber Command, walk us through what you see the greatest challenges are in the immediate and near term in this space, and how and you're looking at it from a DoD perspective. But how does this strategy impact the strategy moving forward?
So I'll tackle that small question, I guess, with
I'm going big, and we'll funnel down.
I think I'll start with as now a defense contractor. One of the interesting things about that strategy that brings forward is if you look at the 3 main things the national defense strategy said, hey, partner operations, reform the organization, i.e. the Department of Defense, and then it's all this ability about increased lethality, which, the military, if you think about it, its simplest form, it does one of 2 things for all of us. It's protection from lethality or the delivery of lethality. And that's really what the military does. So now at the end of that, as you've overlaid cyber into it, how does cyber help protect from or enable the delivery of those 2 things? So our adversaries spend a great deal of time at different phases of warfare to try and figure out how to degrade our ability to deliver or project forces forward. So the first mission of Cybercom when it got stood up is say, hey, how do I ensure that our services, our forces that we're going to deploy forward, or the effects we want to deliver, we can deliver those effects because we can provide the security to the environment they need to do it. Well, that was just the beginning. That was sort of like what I was doing at Cybercom back in the day with the NTOC. We've now created the National Mission Force, which is these 6,200 people divvied up around 133 mission teams distributed across the services that say not only do you have a defensive mission component to what you do, but you've also now got a projection of force mission. I try and stay away from the offensive word because it's got certain connotations associated with it, but it's the delivery of effects. So this cyber strategy helps kind of enable that thinking to say, hey, look, it's okay that we have a military. Militaries do certain things. There's this new domain called cyber. There's a new organization called U.S. Cyber Command. It shouldn't be any secret to anyone that we're thinking about how to do these similar things that we do kinetically, non-kinetically. And I'll end it with sort of a Leidos pitch to all this, which is the interesting part, is that Admiral Rogers said several years ago that when they were building capability in closed-door, backroom things, that was the way that he acknowledged we were going to have to fight in the near term or develop capability. But it's scale that doesn't scale. The Air Force doesn't build airplanes. The Navy doesn't build ships. The Army doesn't build tanks. That's all outsourced to the defense contracting community that says, we're engineers, we're scientists, we have the capacity to develop these things. We'll go build those things for you. Give us the requirements. What we're discovering in the cyber world is that's no different. We're a little behind the power curve, but now the service are trying to say it's scale. We've seen it in traditional IT space. The way that we build networks at scale. And now we're saying, well, how do we build capability at scale? And I think that's the next interesting Pandora's box component that's going to be opened, is building the capability at scale to go conduct all the things that we as a military force need to go do.
And just as a follow-up to that, so you were there in the early days of Cyber Command when it was a sub-unified command under Stratcom, and now it's its own fully unified command that's kind of spreading its wings, so to speak. And also, age-wise, a lot of the perhaps junior level staff at the time are now getting more senior in the ranks. Is there a personality change within U.S. Cyber Command that is leading to kind of where this strategy is trying to drive?
So what I will say about Cybercom specifically, and it'd be interesting your perspective on this afterwards, is the original leadership that was there when it was more of a SIGINT organization, at least what I heard from a military perspective afterwards, that General Alexander was the director of the National Security Agency who also happened to be the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. With Admiral Rogers and General Nakasone, the feeling is it's begun to change, that they're the commanders of U.S. Cybercom who are also the directors of the National Security Agency. I think these guys understand what they got their 4th star to go do. and it was to be the commander of a combatant command as opposed to the director of a intelligence collection organization. And I think that culture has begun to seep its way in to the organization, and the military has sort of got up on their feet a little bit to say, hey, we're here to do more mission as opposed to, let's say, do the traditional missions of the intelligence community, what those organizations were built to do.
Anybody else have anything to add to that? So, Brian Cyprian, what are you seeing at the FBI from the other side of the house with regards to the emerging threats to industry and domestic infrastructure, and how do you view that this strategy may impact the needle one way or another?
Well, I think the strategy basically is kind of in line with what our strategy has been from a overall perspective. When we look at cyber, you say FBI, but it's truly a whole of government approach, and that's been good. But as I mentioned beforehand, it really requires those privately owned networks, so the relationship aspect of it. So one thing I like about the strategy is it does talk about what those responsibilities are, those expectations are, kind of going into the incident response. So from my perspective, the threats, the adversaries are going to be continual. And in this particular aspect, from an investigative aspect, you're usually one step behind the curve because you're trying to identify what happened after it's occurred, and then two, piece those things together so that you can, number one, identify who the subject was and the victim, and then prove each layer in between of how they did it, why they did it, and then if it's a criminal case, you're proving that beyond a reasonable doubt before a jury. National Security, then we're working with our partners to kind of further those matters to either disrupt, deny, degrade that adversary's ability to do what they're trying to do. With this, I think it brings another perspective. For those who take the time to read the strategy, there's like, hey, this is not just a government problem. Cyber's not, as was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, it's not just an IT problem. It's everyone's responsibility, in my mind. If you handle PII, or if you have the keys to the kingdom of your organization, then you have some responsibility and accountability for what you do and how you safeguard that information, because you could very well be the person that breaches or causes the breach. From a incident response standpoint, I think it's good knowing, like, when there is an incident, that shouldn't be the first time that you're thinking, all right, who do I reach out to? How do I go about this engagement? What can I expect? So as we try to do more in outreach and meet with companies and individuals, some of that may be on you as well to reach out and like, hey, we don't really have an incident response plan. The first time you exercise that shouldn't be during an incident because you're not really thinking clearly at that point. So I like the fact that this is coming from someone other than maybe the FBI. I like the fact that a lot of the strategy incorporates the whole of government because we each bring something to the table. DHS, NSA, Cybercom, FBI. But the thing I think people fail to realize is like the key aspect of what a lot of the adversaries want are in private networks. You get the defense industrial base and some of those CDCs and things of that nature, but a lot of these privately owned networks are what they're going after. And a lot of times they hit the lowest hanging fruit to maybe go upstream. So you may say, I'm a small or medium-sized business and I really don't have anything anyone else would want. Let me tell you, you do. And that's the mindset we have to have, and I think this kind of leads into that.
And that's a good segue to talk about workforce, and we'll get to Pillar 2, and I've got some specific questions, Brian Galker, for the plan moving forward. But as somebody who sits over the...
Answer another question.
Oh, yeah, sure, go ahead.
If I could go back to Chris's comment, the first thing I want to clarify is this non-attribution.
Yeah, thank you. That's what...
Is this a non-attribution environment, yes or no?
Which would you prefer?
Well, I'd prefer to be able to give my opinion and it not come back to my bosses. So I was just going to just piggyback on Chris's earlier comment about NSA and Cybercom. And this is my personal opinion, doesn't reflect anything, whatever. But I think it's an evolving relationship between NSA and Cybercom. If you go back to 2011, Cybercom were all the military guys that came in and took all the good parking spaces. And Diana knows that from back. But it's been an evolving process, and I think from the time Cybercom came on board, when it stood up as and the commander got his 4th star. You're right, he has his 4th star because he is the commander of Cybercom. So in the signature block, it's Commander Cybercom / Director of NSA. But I think it's an evolving process. There's getting to be more and more buy-in. It's still not completely there, but I know especially when Cybercom first came to the fort, Cybercom was actually stood up by a lot of NSA integrees who took a whole lot of positions. So over time, those NSA employees who had in-degree positions learned the mission and returned back to NSA. So just like anything, the culture is evolving, and I think the personal relationships that folks had who were NSA folks, then went to Cybercom, then came back, everything's always based on personal relationships. So you kind of broke down a lot of barriers over the last few years, and I think moving forward it is considered a team environment. Absolutely.
So to follow up on Brian C's comments, Brian G, the workforce, as somebody who sits over all of the CAE schools, and you got a bird's eye view of what's going on, is the educational system properly preparing the workforce for today's needs and the emerging needs? And if not, what gaps are there that need to be filled? And how can the CAE community work with the broader educational community at large to make sure that that pipeline exists for the proper workforce?
So you said there would be no hard questions.
Take as much time as you'd like.
Okay.
We got 29 minutes.
We got 29 minutes. Okay. First of all, let me just say that the strategy itself isn't necessarily changing anything that we do. I think it's going to be reinforcing what we do. So we started doing the Centers of Academic Excellence 20 years ago. So it started in the year 2000 when we first designated 7 schools. And since that time, we're up to where we are at 266. The idea behind that, and it was actually jump-started by PDD 63, was that we were going to build the workforce for the nation, for defense of the nation, not just for the DoD, not just for the government. So years ago, when you'd say everybody needs good cyber defense, you know, it kind of fell upon deaf ears because not everybody thought about that. But then you had Sony, you had the OPM, you had everything else that made everybody realize that it is really not only just a whole of government, but a whole of nation problem. So when we set up the Centers of Academic Excellence and we basically set the bar for what the standards are for schools to attain that excellent standard, when we did it years ago, we were kind of the government and we knew the best, so we came up with the criteria ourselves. Well, we matured that over time, and now the schools actually have buy-in to what those KU's knowledge units are. So when we set the criteria, the schools who are part of going to be the answer help define what that is. So we look to the schools to help us with setting what the bar is for that. Over time, we've morphed to, I think, attain what's looked for in the cyber strategy by now having not only Centers of Academic Excellence for cyber defense, but also for cyber operations. So we've been doing that for about the last 5 years, and whereas there's 266 of the cyber defense schools, there's only 20 cyber operations schools. But those schools are the ones who are doing the deep technical education of the folks that we want to be able to do certain offensive type actions that would only be legitimate at NSA or Cybercom or FBI, so to speak. So I think we've morphed the process. Hopefully the strategy is going to reinforce that. What would be great is if funding would come along to a tail to that, because a lot of what we have to do is out of hide at NSA or the goodness of our hearts for academia. But what we have been able to do when we did have funding is to offer some scholarships. So through the National Science Foundation, what they do is they use our CAE moniker as a gatekeeper. So if you're a CAE school, then you can apply for these National Science Foundation, what they call CyberCore or SFS scholarships. So they're a great deal if you're a parent and you're interested. Go to a school that has a CAE program. It's up to a 3-year full scholarship plus a stipend of about $30,000 a year. It's what we call in the business a good deal. So there are those scholarships that are available that I think are going to help with the workforce. Also, within the DoD, we have certain scholarships called what used to be called the Information Assurance Scholarship Program. It's now called the Cybersecurity Scholarship Program, and that's a program that, again, goes through the CAE schools eventually to get DoD employment. And going back to the SFS scholarships, even though they are a full ride for 3 years, there's a payback, a 1-for-1, but the payback is not necessarily to work for NSA or FBI. You can pay that back by working for state, federal, or local government, so to speak.
Very good.
Okay.
So, Chris, the defense industrial base is mentioned multiple times throughout the document, and of course we've all seen the problems with federal contractors, networks not being up to snuff, and that of course impacts downstream to the Department of Defense and ancillary agencies, the 3 letters, et cetera. What needs to happen to move in a direction of securing those networks? What has to happen? Is it a public-private partnership? When does industry start to come in and really drive change before punitive damages start coming in the form of regulation?
Yeah, I think this whole of government approach is really kind of the answer you're searching for, and the FBI would particularly know about this. You know, so if I'm an adversary looking at my target, I'm looking at its soft underbelly, which for most instances is, let's say, the government's supply chain, and supply chain is Coca-Cola and UPS and Ford, and those are the areas that I can engage to degrade the government's, or let's say the military's, ability to do X, Y, and Z. So whether it's intellectual property that we have for weapon systems, or the way that we deliver technology, or just innovation, the adversary is looking at us as sort of that first interesting thing to mine, to figure out how they're going to go do and build their own things or conduct their own operations. I think the debate, or the interesting thing that comes in, and I use the fire department as an analogy. I'd say, you know, as an able-bodied human person, if you're in your kitchen and there's a small fire that breaks out, you should be able to pick up a fire extinguisher and put it out. That's small, it's contained, it's something that is reasonable that you should be expected to go do. If lightning strikes your roof, you're not expected to have a fire engine in your backyard that you know how to use, that you've been trained on, that you can then engage the fire on your roof and put it out. You call the fire department for that. And I think one of the things that we're struggling with in this space is we continue, and as a guy who lives in the security world, again, non-attribution, right? Because I'm now going to be a heretic to my own profession, which says we continue to build products and we push them at people and say, buy this, open the manual, use it, you'll be okay. And if you're not, and you want to have an issue with my product, they say, well, I pushed the button you showed me at the demo. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it's a 400-page manual. You got to read the manual, not just do what I showed you at the demo. Which means you very quickly you might have the capacity or the capability at your fingertips, but you don't have the wherewithal or you can't employ it as it was designed to be used. So the trick is, if I'm Sony and I'm being attacked by a nation state, at which point do I cry uncle? Like, there's certain things that I should be expected to do. I should be up on my compliance standards and patched appropriate and all those other things. But if you are the target of a nation state, look, you're not going to defend yourself. You're just not. There is nothing you're going to buy at the RSA conference that you're going to deploy in your infrastructure that's going to make you impervious to a sophisticated adversary coming to get you. It will make you less attractive than somebody who hasn't bought that stuff. So if you're a bank, I'm going to go find the bank that has the weakest defenses, and I'll take their money, because that's all I want is money. But if I want what you have, and you're the only one that has it, and I'm a nation state, I'm going to get it. So the trick is, at what point do those in industry be able to cry uncle and say, FBI, come help me. Cybercom, you know, I'm a U.S. company on U.S. terra firma. I'm being attacked by a nation state. Somebody come help me. I cannot do this on my own.
So we're jumping around a little bit, but, well, first of all, does anybody have anything to add to that? So we're jumping around a little bit in the pillars, but I think it fits with what you were just saying. So here's 2 quotes that I find interesting, the verbiage. In Pillar 3, preserve peace through strength. Cyberspace will no longer be treated as a separate category of policy or activity disjointed from other elements of national power. Then says, all instruments of national power are available to prevent, respond to, and deter malicious cyber activity against the United States. So you mentioned Sony. So what about this is different from the previous strategy? And if Sony happened now, would the response from the U.S. government be substantially different?
I don't think so.
Anybody?
I think one of the key things, when we mentioned Sony, one of the key aspects for that Sony intrusion was the relationship that existed beforehand. If you're able to have attribution within a month for a nation state, it took, I think within a matter of hours, the FBI Los Angeles office was meeting with Sony side by side working through the intrusion matter. So that expedites things. So to me, I think the strategy is great, but it really boils down to what's your relationship like. So if you are that victim company, and number one, you're ill prepared, or you just choose not to cooperate and work with the government, it's going to delay our ability to be effective. So the strategy is great, but I think it really boils down to the stance of the victim company and what they're willing to do, what they don't, or what they're not willing to do, which goes back to what you can do now, right? So prior to something, left of boom, as they always say in this particular arena, what are you doing? What is your incident response plan? What are your thoughts? Who are the people involved in that? It's great to have the technical practitioners on board, but the key decision makers, the C-suite, needs to know what's going on. Your legal counsel needs to know what's going on and what are the impacts, what's the business decision, how do you make this technical jargon into a business risk? And that's very important. We see that breakdown happen a lot of times. So I really believe it's incumbent upon companies to develop their policy and understand. The strategy is great. It's a great guideline for what should happen, but sometimes our response is impeded by the inability to move quickly with the company. So,
collaborating with FBI and law enforcement is a key component of this as well.
Exactly. I'd say that. I say I'm pitching for the whole government here. DHS has some really good preparedness things that they have available. So that whole approach of just going out there using what's available to kind of develop your strategy is a good approach.
Are you seeing that businesses are becoming more likely to proactively engage with you, and are you finding it easier to get into these places and say, hey, I'm here to help, and everybody doesn't scream?
Sure. I mean, that's part of that is just that knowledge. Number one, knowing what we do, what we can do, what we cannot do. And two, in developing that relationship. A lot of time is spent, like, I worked other violations. There's times we wouldn't engage. The only time we came is when something bad happened or you're applying to become a candidate. That's the only time you really interfaced. Now we're doing a lot more outreach, talking about what it is the FBI could bring to the table, what it is that you should be doing, maybe the consideration of cyber insurance, third-party counsel, incident response in the event that you do have that. We have best practices that we've seen from great companies. We've seen things that haven't gone so well, and we share those stories. Sanitized, of course, so that people have an understanding. But the first time you meet me or an FBI agent or someone that's focused on investigations shouldn't be during that incident. So between both of those actions, we see another thing as well, like with the nature of a lot of the breaches, right? No one's, I say it's an agnostic crime because anyone can be a target, anyone can fall victim to it. So when you see some of the major companies, some of those that were too big to fail or to fall to a compromise, then people start calling up like, hey, we just want to reach out and touch base with you, make sure we got a number or someone to call. So it's twofold now. It's not only us going out to reach out, but a lot of times we see through relationships, through InfraGard, other programs we have in place, people reaching out to us, or maybe a referral from another government agency, and we do the same.
So one last quick question, if nobody has anything to add before I move to the workforce, which I really want to get into before we run out of time, but encryption. So we're talking about how businesses can improve their security posture. We're talking about how everybody needs to be taking more steps in order to protect themselves. And so obviously everybody, I think, probably knows about the issues with fights between Apple and law enforcement over encryption and making sure that law enforcement has the ability to act on actionable intelligence, and that might include breaking into somebody's phone or going into a network. What is the balance that needs to be struck? Because from the other side, of course, well, if you've got a backdoor, so does China, so does Russia. What's the compromise that needs to be struck, and how do you square that as policy going forward so that you can do your job, but also businesses are protected?
Right. That is a difficult challenge. I believe in privacy. I want my own privacy. And my perspective, and I think most of those in law enforcement, would be you should be protected. You should have that privacy. But when you go to someone who's neutral and detached as a judge and you have legal process and you still can't track the path, then that creates a problem. If that becomes a national security matter to where maybe lives could be saved, or maybe a criminal investigation to where others could be prevented from having harm, that concerns me. Now, the fact that you think Big Brother's watching you ever and anything, that is so far from the truth, and nor the case. If you only knew the amount of process it takes to get things done, you'd have a better understanding of it. So from the encryption standpoint, I'm an advocate for it. I just believe that there has to be a way through the proper process, not me calling up and say, hey, I got a buddy at this particular company, I need your assistance. But once I've gone to someone where I provide probable cause to show like, hey, this is why I believe this device needs to be decrypted or whatever the case may be, and allow that judge to make that decision to issue me that process. And if I still can't get in, then that becomes a concern for me. And that, I know that's a very hot topic, but that's my stance on it.
Anybody else on encryption? So Brian Galker, in Pillar 2, developing a superior cybersecurity workforce is one of the key components. One of the things it talks about in terms of building and sustaining the talent pipeline is that our peer competitors are developing and implementing workforce development programs that can hurt our strategic interests. In a public forum, can you fill us in on what you're seeing other nations doing? Are there things that we're learning from other nations? Are we leading the way? Are we behind?
I can't tell you about other nations. Yeah. I can tell you what we're doing, but...
Well, tell us what you're doing.
Okay, I can talk from an IC and from a DoD perspective, and I'll talk about what NSA does. Is we're in the same boat as everybody else. Earlier this morning, there was some statistics about the 3 million cybersecurity professional shortage, et cetera, and NSA is in the same boat as everybody else. Private industry, people are moving around, they tend to jump around. To a certain extent, that happens at NSA as well. When we take people who come out of some of these scholarship programs, we pay them fairly well. So a person who comes to work at NSA with a bachelor's degree is going to get $68,000 a year. If they come with a master's degree, they're going to get about $75,000 a year, which is pretty good money, except when you live in the DC area, that's, you still have to room up with somebody. So NSA has instituted retention bonuses. We also have a separate pay scale for computer scientists, so folks get a little bit of extra money. We, of course, have the locality pay for DC, but our retention, we're still always facing that as a challenge. And when you look at the numbers, and NSA has a historically fairly low turnover rate, but when you kind of analyze that a little bit down and you look at, within the first 5 years, that's the problem that we have is, people who come and get their skill sets and then decide to go to private industry because they can go to a defense contractor and make a whole lot more money. But that's the problem we face. Within the DoD and the services, they have the same thing compounded. A lot of their folks who come in, and we run them through a course down in Pensacola called JCAC, and they come to NSA and learn how to be on the NSA Red Team, and they build up a certain skill set. And if you're an E6 and you're not making a whole lot of money, the incentive there is you're probably either going to come work for NSA or go to a defense contractor because they might not necessarily care that you have a degree, but if you have 6 years experience and you have a TSSCI clearance, you're going to be very attractive. So we're always fighting that same sustainment and retention problem that everybody else does. What we have to do is kind of appeal in a lot of ways towards the patriotic. You come to work in NSA, you get to do stuff that nobody else can do legally with a lot of really neat toys, but also that you make an impact. I didn't talk about we have a cyber operations internship program that we run out of my division, and we bring in kids who are 20, 21 years old. We get them TSSCI clearances, and we run them through a summer internship program with a capstone project. And at the unclassified level, I can just say that they produce operational deliverables that have high impact on targets that the United States is interested in. Did I talk around that enough? Did I talk around that enough? Okay. So we face that. A lot of it is working with the neatest toys, trying to pay them a decent pay scale, have the retention bonuses. Within the DoD, they're looking to come up with a new category of pay just for cyber experts. We're working with the DoD CIO. They're looking at the NICE framework as a model to try to figure out what the skill sets and the work roles are going to be so that they can give, especially our junior enlisted folks, a little bit of extra money in their pay scale. Officers a little less so, but it's a problem that we have, and we have to just keep fighting it uphill. Not any different than academia has. What we've found in looking at academia is a lot of academia, when they get cybersecurity instructors, they poach from one another. So you'll find that one school will recruit somebody to this school, and then they'll bounce to another. And I know you probably have that same challenge here. The way that a lot of schools get around that is through adjunct faculties. But getting a person with a PhD in computer science going to academia, they're not going to be as compensated as they would either working for even the government or especially private industry. So an uphill battle, the same battle that industry has as folks move around, the same battle that academia has.
And you mentioned the NICE framework. Could you explain for the audience what that means and what NSA's role in the future development or collaboration with NICE, Nist, NSF?
Right. So within the Department of Commerce, there's an organization called Nist. Now you're going to catch me on all the acronyms. National Institute of Science and Technology. Yeah. They have a program office within them called NICE. which is the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. So far, so good?
Yep.
Let me Google and see if I'm getting that
You're
right. Okay. So the NICE framework is a Nist publication that came out. They got a whole bunch of input, a lot of it from NSA, but also from industry and academia, where they look to categorize work roles within the cyber realm so that folks can determine what the right work roles, KSA's knowledge, skills, and abilities that you have to fill those work roles so that we can have some kind of standardization in terminology, because lexicons are everything, and everybody says one thing, and a certain term at NSA is going to be something completely different at FBI. It's going to be completely different. So they're trying to standardize that terminology and come up with, if you have these knowledge, skills, and abilities, it logically falls under something that we're going to call a network penetration tester or something to that effect.
Thank you. So about 5 minutes to delve into preserve peace through strength, which is, I'm sure, Chris is giddy about. So in conversations with you, Chris, you've mentioned that you have a particular issue with the term attack, and it's what you call overuse. Can you walk the audience through what you think
that is, in this space, that's the word that drives me crazy the most as a DoD guy. For all of you who are even remotely interested in this, I would recommend picking up a book called The Talon Manual, which is a bunch of guys getting together and just sort of thought through the process and said, hey, let's, if we had to take the laws of armed conflict, rules of engagement, Geneva Convention, and overlay the things we've already come to consider norms in our physical existence, if we had to overlay cyber on it, what would it look like? And so a bunch of lawyers got together and they argue, and it's a starting point. It's not policy, it's anything, but it's an interesting starting point. But in the DoD, we have a very, very specific term for what attack means. It means it's the intentional, you're trying to kill or destroy something. Doesn't mean you're always successful, but that's what you're doing. A cyber attack, unless your intent, like let's use maybe a Stuxnet, to destroy a piece of equipment, is not an attack. If I'm trying to get into your system to take information, I haven't attacked you. I've definitely committed a crime, I've exploited you, I might have conducted espionage, but it's not an attack as defined by, let's say, the Department of Defense. That's just one example of words that I think we tend to misuse.
And so in the context, the broader context of this more, in my opinion, aggressive position, that the full weight of the United States arsenal is a potential option on the table with attacks again. Where is the line drawn now? So if attribution is made to an actor in Russia that attacks a health system and people are dying because that health system is down, what's the proper response from the United States government? Is the first response going to be from the FBI? Is it going to be from the Department of Defense?
Well, I'll go to my Naval War College training, right? So there's the four arms or four levers of sort of power, dime: diplomatic, information, military, economic. It doesn't always mean that military action is your first go-to thing. There's other levers of national power that you can pull. It doesn't mean you're not prepared to do military actions. It's just one of those things that are available to you. I don't think that in responding to any of these things, any four of those levers should be pushed aside for what, that's why we have four levers. That's why they came up with a cool word called DIME, because it spelled a word. But it's way above my pay grade when it would say when we would be in our right to deliver any kind of offensive action. But what I would say is, as a military planner where I cut my teeth at Cyber Command, we're not constrained to sit on a whiteboard and think through all sorts of crazy stuff. We had no capability to do any of those things, but we could think through the delivery of anything we want to do, and then we would take those things and losing proper authorities as we would push those options to commanders, which would float them up the chain of command, and then somebody somewhere way above us would say, that's something we're going to do or not going to do. And if they said no, okay, hey, you pay me to think through the problem this way. And at that time, it was, Chris, figure out non-kinetic ways to deliver effects. Okay, that's my little bucket. And I'd say, this is a way to maybe do it non-kinetically. And some fighter pilot's going to say, well, I could do the same thing by dropping a bomb. And some diplomat might say, I might do the same thing with delivering a demarche. And then some commander somewhere would say, okay, we're going to do X, but they're all options that we could play with, and we'll figure out at a higher how to do it.
And how quickly are we moving into the kinetic world of cyber?
Can I piggyback
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
Chris's comment?
absolutely.
So I taught at the Army War College for 5 years, so I can echo what they were doing up at Newport. When military commanders are given an option, cyber could be one of those options. But from my experience, the problem we have is that knowledge. So at the commander level, at the 06, the general officer level, they're just not familiar enough with cyber yet that I think, and this is again with non-attribution, that I think it's easier for a decision maker to say, I'm going to drop a bomb right there, because you know that building is going to be there tomorrow, and you know if you have a sortie go out, you're going to be able to drop a bomb
and it was
on that
also
tomorrow.
easier to do that,
Right, and
because the
it's
legal
easier.
reviews that had to go through
Yeah.
for doing non-kinetic things back in the day all required presidential authority
Right.
to go do.
And if you think the counter to that is if you want to have a cyber attack, so to speak, and you're planning to execute that tomorrow, well, the sysadmin could change the password, which now you no longer have access. So it's a lot more complicated and difficult to do something as far as a cyber aggressive action than it is something kinetic.
Yeah, this is fun, but I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes?
What would be your reaction to the development of offensive cyber tools in private industry that fight back at the attacker instead of just building
So I love, this is my most favorite question. And so what I would say is, but I'm going to answer it in a way that I think keeps it, look, there's two different discussions there. I'm a defense contractor. Let's say I'm Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin builds a Joint Strike Fighter. Lockheed Martin test pods don't get in that platform and go, they hand it off to the Air Force. The Air Force puts trained military pilots in that platform. We have the authorities given to them to use that weapon system in the so defense contractors, yeah, I'm going to build that stuff all day long based on the requirements of the government that is asking for it. We don't use any of it. I have no authority to take anything that I built in a lab somewhere and to say I'm taking some action I'm going to use this tool that I made and I'm going to go respond in kind. Now, Chris Cleary, the other side of me, says Pandora's box has been opened, and that is, you're going to start seeing that happen. Although, again, defense contractors, we build tools, government has the authorities to use tools.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, good point. I think that authority piece is the case. Just because you develop that capability, maybe that adversary reached your threshold doesn't mean you have that ability to hack back, and that would be the concern. Like,
Say, what if you build, I come to you and I'm a multinational company.
Yeah.
I say, I want you to build me an offensive tool that is like reactive armor on a tank.
Well, I'm going to say, I'm sure there's like arms, and I know totally where you're getting, right? But it would then go to that's at a higher level when we talk about norms or like technology. A commercial company.
Can I act as a private entity offensively against?
If you won the $1.6 billion lottery the other day and you went to Lockheed Martin and said, I want to buy a Joint Strike Fighter, they'd probably say no.
So what about arms exports?
The arms exports is the same thing, right? So the idea is us as a defense contractor, depending on what we're told to go do, like you see lots of weapon systems that U.S. companies sell to other, but they usually tone them down a little bit. Like they don't have all, I'm not going to give you all the capability they give the U.S. military. I'll sell you an F-16, but I won't sell you all the weapons necessarily that go along with it.
But that also has a lot of government oversight.
Tons of government oversight.
Any others? Yes.
I have an answer. I mean, I don't want to hog up any time. So just like anything else, right? Again, I'm going to go back to the government. The U.S. Air Force does not build the Joint Strike Fighter. They contract out with private industry, and private industry figures out how to make that airplane based on their requirements. What we are seeing is in this world, that kind of goes back to my point that back in the day, guys working in skiffs that could come up with some tools, really smart guys can do that, but they can't do that at scale, or they're not product companies. They can't maintain that over time. That's what the defense industrial base is all about. So the defense industrial base, what you're going to find is the government, in my opinion, is going to get out of that game completely. They're going to give those requirements to Palo Alto and Microsoft and Leidos and Verizon, for that matter, to say, bring me capability that I will then paint and camouflage and, well, not weaponize, a touchy word, but let's say whatever you're going to do with it. But the other thing I would say is the last one on this is there's this big argument between security and defense. Security tools are doors with locks and windows with bars and all this other stuff. Defense is active. So maybe back to your point, you know, if you're in your home and you're a lawful gun owner, there's some things that you being attacked have sort of a right to self-defense, but you can't chase that guy down the street and into the neighbor's yard and into the next town because you're going to bring him to justice. No, there's certain things that you're allowed to do and certain things you aren't allowed to do. That is one of the slippery slopes with, you know, maybe right to self-defense in cyber becomes an interesting debate.
So we are out of time, unfortunately. Sorry if we didn't answer any questions, but everybody, I think, will be around for a few minutes afterwards if you want to come up and ask. But thank you very much. Welcome, or thank the panel for participating today. Oh, you've already done it. Okay.